Lord Salisbury, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I was enjoying it so much that I was rather disappointed he had to pass the baton on. And can I echo your sentiment about how nice it is to see people in the flesh? It's absolutely marvellous to see you here. And also to celebrate the opening of our fabulous new lecture theatre, which, for those of you who are sitting in particular decks, you'll realise that you can swivel your chairs round now and speak to the person behind you. You can work in groups. It's a marvellous innovation in terms of teaching and the facility for teaching. As Lord Salisbury suggested, I'm going to talk this evening about university admissions. My title is, Are they fair by design, or are they a loaded lottery? Of course, by many measures, the system of admissions to British universities is very good. Most applicants are able to attend the university of their choice. The numbers of those failing to complete their degrees are low by international standards, and there are excellent employment rates for our graduates. Yet, we still need to ask whether the system is truly fair. Is it fair to the applicants themselves? Is it fair to employers looking for graduates with the right set of knowledge, skills, and behaviours? And of course, is it fair to society as a whole, which invests considerable amounts of money in higher education and wants a reasonable return, both in terms of tax revenue and wider societal fabric? There are obvious reasons why this matters. The graduate premium in lifetime earnings amounts to about £170,000 for men and about £250,000 for women, and it's remained relatively constant over the last 20 years in real terms. There's therefore a genuine economic advantage in getting into university. Graduates also benefit in other ways, since they tend to, believe it or not, drink less, exercise more, suffer less depression, and live longer. Yet there are still many more applicants to universities than acceptances. In 2020, about 570,000 out of a total of 730 applicants were accepted. Furthermore, there are a number of universities for which application numbers greatly exceed their capacity. Their courses therefore represent a limited resource in high demand. So finding a fair way of selecting students for admission is clearly essential. It's also, surely, a matter of natural justice to create a system which is seen to be fair to as many people as possible. So what do we mean by fair? And how can we create a system of admissions which would be considered fair by most people? A simple lottery would be fair in the sense that everyone would have an equal chance and no partiality would be shown. Indeed, weighted lotteries are used in some countries. Nevertheless, I think it's fair to say that a lottery would be unlikely to provide the best outcomes for employers or for society. I want to offer some more considered thoughts on fairness, drawing on Isabel Nisbet and Stuart Shaw's 2020 book, Is Assessment Fair?, before offering some more concrete suggestions of my own. Now, Isabel was, of course, a governor of this university, and our book therefore carries huge prestige. In considering assessment, she argues that a fair process should be valid and reliable. It should meet legitimate expectations. It should be impartial, and it should consider the context of the candidate, for instance, previous educational experience. I'm now going to examine each of these criteria in turn. In considering the validity of application processes, it's first important to decide what universities are selecting candidates for. Is success measured just by completing the course, or by gaining a good degree, a 2-1 or a first? Are we selecting for students who might become the most accomplished scientists, mathematicians, historians, or the most likely to progress to postgraduate study? Or are we looking at future professional achievement, those who might become the best teachers, engineers, or doctors? We might also be selecting for those who will make the best citizens, or those for whom university might make the biggest difference. There are, of course, universities and indeed applicants which desire each and often several of these goals. Once we've decided on our goals, we also need to look at the validity of different methods of selection. Are A-levels and other terminal summative examinations as valid as qualifications which consist of assignments and continual assessments such as the BTECs? These are the Business and Technology Education Council Awards. Or would it be more appropriate to have standardized admission tests such as the SATs, the scholastic aptitude tests widely used in US college admissions? The International Baccalaureate also has benefits in terms of its breadth of study and the mixed modes of assessment, as well as more international recognition and, of course, a historic legitimacy. Certain assessment methods are commonly used to test aptitude for particular vocations. Familiar examples include portfolios of material to determine artistic merit, presentations in the performing arts, and interviews to assess empathy and other appropriate characteristics in the caring professions. Interviews, more generally, raise a number of issues. Their reliability can be enhanced, of course, by embracing standard structure, though this can suppress the spontaneity which often differentiates candidates. They're also criticized for selecting people like the interviewers, rather than those with different but equally useful attributes. They're therefore unlikely to enhance diversity unless some sort of affirmative action is taken in the selection of the interviewers. Another problem is that calling applicants to interviews can put up barriers to those from lower income households, those who may not be able to afford the transport costs to get to universities or have the technology required for virtual interviews. Similar factors also apply to personal statements, since more disadvantaged applicants are likely to receive the least support from tutors, career advisors, and perhaps don't have the pushy parents who themselves may contribute to the process more, perhaps, than they ought. They may also lack the social capital conferred by visits to potential workplaces and supporting extracurricular activities. The next criterion, reliability, can be broken down into precision and repeatability. So how precise is the method of assessment? Is a candidate who scores 65% distinctly better than one who scores 64%? Or does the imprecision of the method mean that a grade boundary of, say, 5% between 62.5 and 67.5 is a more appropriate level of granularity for selection? It's also important that repeated assessments give the same results. Their fairness is likely to be questioned if a single piece of work gets very different marks on different occasions, or when considered by different assessors. Some universities address this in their own assessment processes through double marking and accepting average marks, or even, when necessary, bringing in a third marker. It's also possible to derive some confidence in the reliability of a test if a statistically valid number of cases are double marked and any differences are found to be acceptably low. I think, though, we must now look at a particular distinctive feature of the British higher education system. In the United Kingdom, more than 97% of 18-year-olds who apply to university do so before their assessment results are known, on the basis of their teachers' predictions of what grades they're expected to get. Yet the accuracy of such predictions is low, with only between 15 to 25% of predicted and actual grades matching exactly. Teachers are, however, actually highly consistent in making predictions, It's just that they consistently overpredict, usually by about 2 points, where an A is 5 points, a B is 4 points, a C is 3 points, and so on. And this is hardly surprising, given that the judgment of their teaching quality often depends on the examination results. There's also a view, particularly in the United States, that black students are hampered by the low expectations of their white teachers. It's also claimed that basing offers on predicted grades could further harm already disadvantaged students, presumably on the assumption that those in disadvantaged areas or schools are likely to be given those in advantaged areas or schools are likely to be given relatively higher predictions. Yet, university admission systems have become highly capable at compensating for the more common forms of overprediction. And the data, and by this I mean actual data, do not indicate that utilizing predicted grades harms equality generally. Indeed, for most disadvantaged groups, it has a positive impact. So it's likely that the use of predictions is less unfair than might be imagined. Nevertheless, it's self-evident that to use actual results is more accurate, and it provides a more transparent platform for the legitimate expectations of applicants and more broadly for society. Legitimate expectation represents the second pillar of fairness set out by Nisbet and Shaw. The legitimate expectation of applicants to university has, of course, changed according to government policy and the expansion of higher education. In 1950, only about 4% of traditional age cohorts went to university. By 2014, that had increased to 48%. It would be fair to assume that the legitimate expectation of many more applicants is success in the process than it was in 1950. And this is reflected in the number of people applying. It's also influenced by published information. If a university sets out entry requirements for a particular course as AAB, and the applicant achieves AAB, they will have a legitimate expectation of recruitment. Yet such information has also become important from an institutional marketing perspective, since entry grades offer a proxy for quality, with many universities inflating their advertised minimum entry grades to attract a larger number of applicants, but then, of course, accepting students with lower grades below those advertised. There's a strong argument from a fairness and transparency perspective that institutions should publish the actual grades at which they recruit, accepting that these may have to be retrospective. There are, of course, legitimate expectations from employers and from society that graduates have acquired the knowledge, the skills, and the behaviors essential to their jobs. So we could perhaps legitimately expect higher entry grades for more academically demanding careers, such as medicine. Yet, I think it's important to balance this against the unnecessary grade expectations of some professional, statutory, and regulatory bodies, which can be perceived as creating closed shops to encourage demand-driven salary premia for those already in post. The third pillar of fairness relates to impartiality, or ensuring that relevantly like cases are treated alike. Universities in the UK now pride themselves on impartiality, although this has not always been the case either here or elsewhere. In the US, some universities have historically embraced explicit donor preference schemes, whereby the children of large donors, as well as the children of alumni, are given preferential access. For privately funded institutions, this may be acceptable if unpalatable. Where higher education is supported by the state, as in the United Kingdom, it's considered inequitable to give advantage based on anything beyond the merit of the candidate. This does not mean that applicants will be treated in exactly the same way by every university. Each institution has its own character, its own prestige and capacity. The important thing is that the universities of Oxford and Hertfordshire, for example, will each treat applicants to their universities in the same way. Concerns are often raised about the relatively low number of recruits to Oxford and Cambridge and other pre-92 universities from ethnically diverse backgrounds and poorly performing state schools. So might impartiality be enhanced if applicants or if applications were anonymised and information such as their school or college removed? There are mixed views on the benefit of anonymised recruitment more generally, indeed out with the higher education sector. It was shown to improve the gender balance in the Boston Symphony Orchestra when auditions were held behind a screen. However, ascribing a woman's name to a name-blind CV in the Australian civil service increased the chance of the applicant making it to interview by about 3%, contrary to the fear that bias might be shown in favour of male candidates. Anonymisation could support impartiality if it's combined with overt contextualisation. Otherwise, it could have the opposite effect, since it's likely that contextualisation on the basis of race or school is often already implicitly taken into account. Concerns about access to elite universities by ethnic minorities do not extend to universities in general, since Chinese, Asian, black, and mixed-race groups all are more likely to go to university than white students. The fourth pillar of fairness relates to context, which, where university admissions are concerned, refers to previous educational experience. It's all very well to be completely impartial on the basis of A-level results, but that's not fair to a student who carries a legacy of prior educational disadvantage. In this regard, it's useful to consider issues of equality, deservedness, and merit. From an equality perspective, a compelling argument can be made to compensate individuals who have been historically disadvantaged, since the qualifications that they bring to the admissions process reflect their previous educational and more broadly social experience and not their future potential. It's known that a male student from a state school is nearly 7% more likely to get a good degree, that's a 2-1 or a first, than a student from an independent school who had equivalent A-level grades at entry to university. Let me just say that again because it's sometimes difficult to get your head around this. It's known that a male student from a state school is nearly 7% more likely to get a good degree, that's a 2-1 or a first, than a student from an independent school who had equivalent A-level grades at entry to university. Furthermore, as the tuition fees at the independent school go up, so the degree outcomes come down by about 1% for every extra £2,000 spent relative to the student from the state school with equivalent tariff at entry. I'll let that sink in just for a second. Research indicates that the effect of social background on attainment begins, of course, at the age of 2, and indeed that a child from the most deprived cohort is likely to have heard 30 million fewer words than one from the most advantaged by the age of 3. The question then arises, how best to determine the level of disadvantage of the individual and how much to compensate for this? And I'm afraid there's no right answer. In an ideal world, each applicant would be considered as an individual with a battery of metrics ranging from parental income, family circumstances, the location of their home, and the historical achievement of their school, among many other things. Ideally, a similar range of metrics would be embraced by all universities, such that there was equal compensation. This is well beyond the current admissions systems in subtlety and complexity. Nevertheless, in Scotland, universities have embraced a robust and workable system using the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation, that's the SIMD. This is based on 7 domains: income, health, employment, education, housing, crime, and environment. And universities use the lowest or the 2 lowest quintiles of deprivation as priority cohorts for contextualization. Each university then sets a minimum entry requirement for every program, which should allow successful recruits to complete their course. Applicants from the 2 lower quintiles who achieve the minimum requirement are then accepted onto the course outside the general competitive process. Is it possible to use measures of deservedness to assist in creating a fair admissions system? One of the tragedies of life is that diligent, hard-working individuals who deserve success are often usurped by opportunistic chancers who have the inherent ability to succeed with less effort. For a hard-working individual of a modest natural ability, a university admission system based on a terminal summative assessment process such as A-levels could appear unfair. It could also be argued that from an employer's perspective, someone who's more diligent, hard-working, is often a greater asset than their lazy but more able counterpart. In most US schools and universities, and some UK universities, including the University of Hertfordshire, the traditional UK degree categories have been replaced or supplemented, in our case supplemented, by a grade point average. This gives an outcome based on assessment throughout the course. It encourages steady effort, and it offers a future employer a measure of both effort and ability. At the point of entry to university, it's also likely that the BTEC and the IB, the International Baccalaureate systems, which include assignments and coursework, support the more diligent applicants. It's interesting to note that graduates who gained admission to universities through BTECs have better employability outcomes than graduates who attain admissions through A-levels. Finally, there's the question of merit. Is someone worthy of admission to a university? Whether assessed over a period of time or by summative examination, it's likely that candidates who are both diligent and able will score well and will be considered worthy of admission. The idea of a meritocratic society in which those who are worthy succeed is rather more universally accepted now than it was when first described by Alan Fox in 1956 as a society in which the gifted, the smart, the energetic, the ambitious, and the ruthless are carefully sifted towards their desired positions of dominance. Nisbet and Shaw devote considerable effort to debating the value of merit from the perspective of fairness in assessment, but eventually reject it on the basis that it does not account for social context and is likely to be greatly influenced by the merit of the individual's parents. For university admission, however, merit potentially brings together many of the elements of fairness already discussed. It conforms to many principles of natural justice. It can be used to discriminate within a competitive process or to determine adequacy for a particular course. It's fair in the sense of impartiality to the individual, the provider, employers, and to society. And used together with contextualization or compensation for previous educational disadvantage to offer a form of restorative justice, merit emerges as the most appropriate measure for admission to university. It's also likely that a system of admission based on merit will select students able to succeed in their courses, and the validity and reliability of any measure of merit can be tested by retrospective analysis of success rates at university. It remains unfortunate, therefore, that limited government enthusiasm for radically changing school or college assessment methods, not to mention the fiercely autonomous institutional character of UK universities, makes it unlikely that standardised measures of merit will be created or accepted. Having now considered the basic elements of fair admissions, how can they be translated into a practically workable system? First of all, it would be fairer if everyone was subjected to the same entrance process, at least for particular courses or groups of courses. There's also a strong argument for standardised testing, though sometimes using specific tests, such as the biomedical admissions test, relevant for particular courses. A general test for all university applicants might pick up universally desirable attributes, such as critical thinking, but it would potentially fail the validity test, since the required competency and aptitude in numeracy for mathematics, it would be quite different from the required creativity for an arts course. What about common interviews? It seems unnecessary and expensive for a candidate applying to 5 different nursing schools to have to do 5 separate interviews. On the other hand, universities are very diverse institutions. So an interview for a veterinary place at Glasgow with strengths in cattle medicine and pathological research might, with very good reason, be different from an interview for the Royal Veterinary College in London with strength in small animal medicine and surgery. There's also a strong argument that the interview process gives the candidate a chance to assess the institution and to determine if it would fit with their character, values, and expectations. I've already considered the issue of predicted grades and argued that actual results would be more appropriate. This, however, represents a major practical challenge. The results of A-levels and other Level 3 assessments are made available to candidates and universities in the middle of August. The time required to complete the recruitment process for students to get their results, apply to up to 5 universities, perhaps undergo an interview or several interviews, receive and decide between any offers would make it virtually impossible to start a course at the beginning of October. Though it would theoretically be possible to change the school or university timetable, neither sector seems enthusiastic about doing so. It has been proposed that the university start date be moved to the January following the A-level results day. But this would mean candidates spending about 6 months in limbo, a time too short to get useful employment or to have a worthwhile gap year, but ideal for allowing 18-year-olds to engage in antisocial behaviour or to sink into idle despair. A more workable proposal was made by the Universities UK group, which reviewed fair access to universities in 2020. According to this, candidates would still put in their applications any time from the January before the September-October start date. When their assessment results are released, universities would make offers to suitable candidates who would then choose which to accept. There would still be a clearing system, much as now, to pick up candidates whose results fall below expectations or do not receive an offer from any of their chosen universities. The whole process has been modelled by the Universities and Colleges Admission Service, UCAS, and would allow time for everything to be completed by the current university start dates. One concern is that students might not receive the appropriate information and guidance in what might be described as a teacher-light period of the year at the end of the summer holidays. This could be overcome, of course, by the Department of Education providing high-quality careers advice at that time of year. Furthermore, applicants should already have been receiving advice from their school careers advisors for the 6 months leading up to the results day. In the current predicted results system, most students, more than 70%, are accepted to their first choice university, and there's no reason to anticipate that this would change negatively if actual results were used. From a standpoint of fairness, a post-qualification offers system is the compelling option. The idea of offers being made on actual rather than predicted grades is not a new one. It was recommended for development by Schwartz and his colleagues when they reviewed fair admissions in 2004. That it has not happened is down to the self-interest and inflexibility on the part of the actors involved, and lack of commitment and courage by successive education secretaries. The second radical reform required to enhance fairness in the admissions process is a more reliable and uniformly applied system of contextualisation to compensate applicants for previous educational disadvantage. The Scottish system described earlier is sufficiently pragmatic to be widely adopted, yet sufficiently flexible to give confidence that institutional autonomy is not compromised. So a system of contextualisation using the index of multiple deprivation, which ranks population areas of around 1,500 inhabitants, should be adopted in England and should embrace at least the two lowest deciles of disadvantaged applicants. One option would be to allow each higher education provider to select its own minimum entry grades, at which applicants in the lower index of multiple deprivation deciles would be accepted. Alternatively, a universally agreed tariff uplift could be applied to such applicants, perhaps graded across several of the lower deciles. The index of multiple deprivation is sufficiently granular to give a reasonable prediction of likely deprivation. There are other methods, such as whether applicants received free school meals or whether they were in care during their school education. These are also useful, but the data on these is not universally available, and it's subject to data protection legislation. It's unlikely that an admissions system could ever be created which would appear fair to all applicants, to parents, to universities, to future employers, and to society. The system that we have is by many measures good, but from the perspectives of reliability, legitimate expectation, and restorative justice, it could be improved. A post-qualification offer system with more uniform contextualisation adjustments for previous educational disadvantage would be fairer, it would be more transparent, and it would be more just, and we owe it to future generations to make it work. Thank you very much.